People who own silver need to understand about what's happening with silver than to look at the deliveries, okay? This is the most important thing to understand as far as I am concerned, period. And so if we talk, let's go back a month and talk about December. The December delivery notices were at 12,575 contracts. It's the largest all-time high record for a month of December on COMEX. 12,575 times 5,000 ounces per contract is 62,875,000 ounces were delivered in December. Now, when it gets delivered, that means someone said, I don't want a paper promise, I want the real metal. Now, that doesn't all leave COMEX. A lot of it goes into the COMEX in what is called eligible. Registered are the bars that you can stand for delivery on inside the system backing the contracts. Eligible means, you know what, it's here, it's ours, it's in the vault, we're not moving it, it's not for sale, thank you very much. But the question is, who the hell is standing for possession for 63 million ounces of silver? A 500 ounce box of Silver Eagles weighs 42 pounds. What do you think 63 million ounces weighs? And who's doing it? And where is the journalistic integrity across the entire mainstream asking this question, because it's happened for 13 straight months now? Since Trump won the election, every single month, it's record after record after record after record. Billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of gold and silver every single month. Well, let's look at what's happened in the first 6 days of January. In the first 6 days of January, the first 6 delivery days of the January contract, there have already been 5,451 gold contracts that have stood for delivery at 100 ounces apiece, plus 6,321 silver contracts that stood for delivery. That is 545,100 ounces of gold and another 31,605,000 ounces of silver. Who's doing this? That's billions and billions here 6 days into the month with another 24 yet to go.
Andy Schectman says the global money system is changing fast. Huge amounts of physical gold and silver are being taken from exchanges by central banks and big companies. China is moving away from the dollar, inflation is weakening cash, and gold and silver protect real wealth. Thanks for watching. Give a thumbs up and subscribe to Fine Metals for the latest insights.
In 2011, as an example, when silver popped up to 50 bucks, they jacked up the margin requirement so much that the price collapsed. Now, what is margin? They did it twice in the last 3 weeks here. The last one was the day after Christmas, where the CME group or the COMEX says you need to put more money in your margin account to control silver. Let's talk about it briefly. On Christmas Day, you would have had to roughly have about $21,000 in your margin account to control a 5,000-ounce silver contract, which in essence is $350,000 worth of silver controlled with just 20 grand in your account, right? They say the next day on the 26th, we're raising margins by 30%. So you need to now put another, $6,000 in your margin account, $27,000. So these traders who figure I'm going to go way in on margin and capitalize on this spike in silver and I'm going to load up on it, all of a sudden they need to come up with 30% more margin. So they're forced to sell some of their contracts to cover their margin requirement, which drives the price down, which begets more selling and more selling. All of these traders on margin. Now here's where it gets interesting, right? And I'm going to use a real estate analogy because if you go into a gated neighborhood where homes are $30, $40, $50 million, I had lunch the other day at an owner of a Major League Baseball team's home. He lives 2 houses away from Mark Wahlberg, and Alicia Keys is right down the street. And these houses are all $30 to $50 million each. And do you think they care what mortgage rates are? Hell no, they don't. They pay with cash, and it's probably their second or third home. However, in a neighborhood like mine where a lot of the people are on mortgages, if mortgage rates jack up, what's it going to do to the value of everyone's homes? Going to go lower. Not in that neighborhood, but in mine it would, and in yours it would. Now, let's change that over to the COMEX. So they jack up the margin rates. All of these traders who may have millions of dollars in their account, but they don't have billions in their account, like we're seeing billions stand for delivery every week and month. So these traders are over their head in who they're playing with in the sandbox. They're forced to liquidate their positions, which drives down the price. But who's standing there not caring about margin are the sovereign wealth funds, the central banks, the Teslas, the Samsungs. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I just bought it at 10, 20% less than it was yesterday. Thank you. It's an orchestrated attack on the longs that always killed the market. Not this time, because what's different this time than anything I have ever seen before is the standing of delivery. These contracts always had a standing for delivery option, but my whole 35-year career, no one stood for delivery, less than 1%. The share of U.S. dollar reserves as a global foreign currency or reserve currency has fallen to its lowest level this century, ever. It's happening. The de-dollarization is real. And what the Chinese are doing, which is very interesting, and I believe this to be the rails that they're building for the BRICS, instead of antagonizing President Trump and the administration about really building the BRICS unit infrastructure, which is something we've talked about on your show for a while, and the unit is actually operational, as is the infrastructure beginning to mature. But what China has done, first and foremost, is, of course, they have their rails, if you will, which is the bridge technology, that is M-Bridge, that allows countries to trade central bank digital currencies amongst themselves on a platform that settles in 7 seconds outside of SWIFT interference at a 98% reduction in fees. They've already partnered up with the countries in Southeast Asia. Their acronym for this group is ASEAN, ASEAN. They represent China's largest trading partner by far. They're twice the population of the United States, about 800 million people, and represent 30% of global GDP. They are now settling across this settlement system, which the SWIFT doesn't mesh with. The interesting thing about it is, along with that, what China has done is begun to nationalize or internationalize their yuan by building a series of multi-jurisdictional vaults that belong to the Shanghai Metals Exchange. When metal is delivered out of China, it has to leave through Hong Kong. So the first vault that they built is in Hong Kong. It's done. So if, for example, China were to trade with Saudi Arabia for oil and they pay for it using their digital yuan over the bridge technology, which, again, SWIFT can't intervene, the Chinese or the Saudis can immediately take that digital yuan, send it back to the Shanghai Metals Exchange in Hong Kong, and stand for physical delivery of metal. In other words, if they don't want to hold the digital yuan, it is immediately convertible now into gold on the Shanghai Exchange and deliverable. But now they're building more vaults. The next one, believe it or not, is under construction in, of all places, Saudi Arabia. And they plan on putting these vaults in multi-jurisdictions all throughout the Belt Road so that all of these countries can trade their own central bank currency without interference of the SWIFT system, settle immediately at a massive reduction in fees, not have to convert to dollars through U.S. intermediary banks. Well, let's go back to the end of 23. The European Union said silver is a critical mineral. That's what the EU did, largely missed. Everyone is focusing on what the Chinese said here in January, but let's continue the timeline. In November of this year, before they made that announcement, they said that they are now going to prioritize silver and exporting of it for domestic needs. And then the United States says, well, but it is now a critical mineral here in the U.S., which is huge, putting a policy floor, a national security floor, if you will, underneath the price of silver. And then China comes out and says, well, we are going to restrict silver exports. And to your point, in terms of doré refining, doré being bars that are crudely refined by miners who then send them somewhere to be fully refined. Well, a lot of that silver all around the world in doré form found its way to China, who, to your point, does refine between 60 and 70% of all the world's doré, which then they refine into pure silver. They said, yeah, we're going to restrict to only state-sponsored refineries. There were hundreds of smaller and mid-sized refiners that would send their metal out into the Western market that now do not meet the qualifications. And if they are state-sponsored and have to get a permit through Beijing, knowing that in November they said exports will be really rethought and prioritized to domestic needs, and we're going to restrict them, and you must get permitted first, along with silver being classified strategic in the European Union and the United States. You can see that this is happening. Now, I've said on your show for quite some time that I have friends in the mining industry, Sean Kuhn and for Dolly Varden in particular, and Keith Neumeyer for First Majestic, who have said that that Chinese, who are the number 2 largest producer in the world, are flying around Latin America for years buying pre-refined silver from the mines themselves. In other words, doré and concentrate, which is a byproduct of the mining process, shipping it back to China and refining it themselves, so that the market has no idea how much they are buying, and it doesn't have an effect on the price. But they've been doing that for years. It's the biggest companies in the world and the biggest banks and the biggest central banks. These people forget about the wealth. How about the information? They're closest to the information. They do not spend billions upon billions upon billions upon billions right in your face with no media attention, which really makes it interesting, for the hell of it. They know the playbook. And when you're at that level of wealth, you're at that level of information and knowledge, which is worth more than the money backing it. And these metals are being proven to be worth more than the dollars paying for it. And when you see all of these banks that are, in essence, internalizing physical silver exposure by owning it rather than leaving it floating in the exchange ecosystem, it should really wake people up. And that is one of the old sayings about gold and silver that Doug Casey made famous, and that is gold and silver are 5,000, 6,000-year-old assets that are simultaneously no one else's liability. There's no counterparty risk. And that's a big deal when you look at the behavior of the biggest money in the world, suggesting that they're prioritizing physical possession and removal of counterparty risk over anything else. When I started in this industry in 1989, I learned maybe the most valuable lesson, although I didn't learn it for a long time, but I learned the beginning of the most valuable lesson I've ever learned in investing. And actually, the only absolutes that I've ever learned, because we live in a world of probabilities, not absolutes, and it's very difficult to be certain about anything in this fluid world we live in, especially when you look back over the last 5, 6 years. But the only thing I've ever learned in absolute in terms of finance is that markets go higher to the upside than anyone will ever think possible, and will fall further to the downside than anyone ever thinks possible. Case in point, the Japanese Nikkei, when I started back then, and they owned Rockefeller Center and Pebble Beach Golf Course and casinos in Vegas, and anything with a motherboard, a digital or electronic, they made better. Any engine, Honda, Toyota, Nissan, were better than the Americans. And their Nikkei was 40,000. And then it fell all the way down to 12,000 with their interest rates at or near zero for the last 30 years. And now it's not even quite back up to where it was. It's been a whole generation. So that market fell further than anyone thought possible, because back then people thought they were taking over the civilized world with their, they were buying everything with their massive trade surplus, because they were selling everything to the world, digital and cars and motorcycles and, VCRs and TVs and stuff. But on the other hand, at that time, the Dow Jones was 2,100. And the first conference I went to in 1990, a guy was laughed off the stage for saying the Dow would go to 10,000. Well, it didn't go. It did go to 10, but it also went above 40. So the point is, markets go higher to the up and fall further to the down than anyone ever thinks possible. So no, I do not think we are late at all. And if Bank of America is even remotely close, saying next year they're talking $5,000 gold and silver between 100 and 309, no, and using the historical ratio between the two as a guide rail for that, no, we're not late. Yeah, sure, it would have been better to buy earlier, but, at the Dow Jones 10,000, people should have been asking the same thing, and at 20, and at 30. So, no, it's not too late, but the longer you wait, the later it becomes. And instead, if you're uncertain, instead of going all in, then employ cost averaging.